All right, today we're going to talk about Britain and what it would look like if we had a structural constitution. And actually, that's a much easier thing than what I normally deal with. Because I do think that it's going to be easier to persuade people in Britain that we need something of structure than it is to persuade people what rights we need. Because when you get into rights, you've got various people saying that asylum seekers should have no rights and so on and so forth, and the really interesting debates about whether privacy counteracts free speech, and the more recent one about whether Elon Musk should have free speech. But the structure is actually much easier to deal with. I mean, you are dealing with people who have power and who don't want to give it up, but nevertheless, I think it's something we can look at rationally without getting into a heated debate. And what I'm going to do is look at the American situation, and I want to say nothing's perfect. I'm going to put a picture up here. I think I've probably chosen the wrong week to talk about how fabulous the American Constitution is. But actually, I think it's the right week, because Donald Trump is threatening us with all sorts of things. And the next 4 years are going to be the real test of whether the US Constitution protects us from populism. And the thesis I have today, I must say, is the UK doesn't have a protection from populism. My bet is we're going to win it out in America. I will say in the first Trump administration, I'm proud of the fact that I was the very first person to sue Donald Trump. I was watching him as he was being sworn in, and I waited until just he'd finished being sworn in before hitting go on the litigation. I think we held him at bay in the first administration. It'll be interesting in the second one. But let's begin a bit with some of the discussion of what you need to protect your structure, your country, from populists, because I think we're all looking at them. We're looking at them across Europe, we're looking at them in America, and in Britain too, we have our Reform Party and various things like that. So let's go all the way back to the Romans. I mean, you can go further to Athens, of course, but the Roman structure up until 32 BC was basically one of checks and balances. It was what they called a republic. It was the Roman Republic. In 32 BCE, it became the Roman Imperium. And that's what you worry about if a populist is taking over. I think it goes without saying that the president I didn't vote for would love to be an emperor. And he's talked a little bit about getting rid of the Constitution. But you have a structure to try to prevent that. And it didn't save the Romans, but for a long time it did. And the structure was basically a tripartite thing, not quite the same as what we've had since. But if you look just at 40 BCE, you had the Senate, where they would debate and pass laws. You had the assemblies, which actually didn't have any structural power, but was where the people could get together in public and talk about what they wanted, and that did have a lot of influence. And then you had the two consuls who only had their power for a year. That was designed to prevent them getting too powerful, and there were two of them so that it wasn't just one person. And that was the general Roman structure of government. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that, but it's something that we really followed through the years, and we refined it in many ways. But when you look at the US structure, which was defined very carefully in the Constitution, the US specifically didn't aim to be what's called a democracy, because the pure form of democracy, as is so often said, is the tyranny of the majority over the minority. And the US structure was designed to be a republic with a small r, with checks and balances and three primary facets of government. You had the executive, the president, who was the one who was meant to run the country, with the cabinet and all the other people. You had the legislature, which was meant to create the law, and it was structured very particularly. The Senate was elected every 6 years. You had a 6-year term, so every 2 years, a third of the Senate would get reelected. And then the House, which was a 2-year term, and they would have to run for re-election every 2 years. And the idea of that was that the Senate would be both more secure, perhaps, in their position, but also they wouldn't be elected at exactly the same time. So whatever the wave of populism was, hopefully it wouldn't infect both houses and the one would check the other. And meanwhile, the legislature would pass the laws and they would try to check the executive. If the executive didn't like the legislature's laws, they could veto it. The president could veto it, but then that could be overridden by a supermajority of 2/3. Then you got the judiciary, and the judiciary was designed to have life tenure, so people didn't have to worry about losing their job. And ultimately, it was meant to hold everything in line for the other two branches. Now, if you look at Britain back then, it was essentially the same structure. You had a monarchy, and there had been a time when the monarchy was the Roman Imperium, right? It was the monarchy had all the power, and only around about 1215 did you begin to start getting some other power for primarily the rich people in the legislature with the Magna Carta. But by 1787, you had a judiciary that was moving towards independence. The monarchy used to appoint the judges and could dismiss the judges if they didn't like the ruling, but in 1700 that was changed. The legislature was gaining power. Still, the House of Lords was the most powerful of the two, but you had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Commons was very much run by the rich people, and you've all heard of rotten boroughs and all the rest of it. But you did have this tripartite structure, and the king was still pretty powerful. What we need to look at is how this has changed over the last 250-odd years. And it's changed very differently in the two countries, and I think it's important to understand how it's done in America to see how incredibly woolly the British system is and the dangers that now face you all in this country. So let's start with how we amend the Constitution. It's a very complicated system. It requires Congress, both houses of Congress, so both the Senate and the House. You have to have 2/3 of both houses. Very rarely does one party have 2/3 of one house, let alone have 2/3 of both houses. So in order to propose a constitutional amendment, it's got to be something that people basically all tend to agree with. There have been a few exceptions to that, of course. And then even once it's passed after great debate in Congress, it then has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So that's 38 of the states at the moment. And you think about it in Britain, it'd have to be 3/4 of the British, whatever you count, whether you count Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, or whether you're going to take into account certain other elements of it, like Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands and all that good stuff. And the third provision in amending the Constitution is that no state without its consent could be deprived of its equal suffrage vote in what was going on in the country, in the Senate. And that, again, was to prevent a constitutional amendment that would take away the power of an individual state. Now, then you look at how this whole process happens in Britain. First, I should say, we don't get it right all the time in America, but as an interesting example I just wanted to mention is the 18th Amendment, which was never my favorite amendment. That's the one that abolished the right to alcohol in America. And, there was a big push in the just towards the end of World War I, 1917, 1918, to get rid of alcohol because that was seen as the root of all evil. And it was led by people like Rockefeller, who really thought it was the root of all evil. And they passed the 18th Amendment, it was ratified, and alcohol was banned, and what did you see? You saw that you had speakeasies in Chicago, that crime became rampant, even more rampant. And then we had the 22nd Amendment, where even Rockefeller, a great proponent of the 18th Amendment, had decided it was a big mistake. And so just a few short years later, we passed an amendment that changed it back again and said, no, the 18th Amendment was a mistake. And that's important because while you need a really consistent and quite complicated structure to change the Constitution, one of the issues we'll get to in Brexit is whether there needs to be a way for us to accept we make mistakes. I'm going to put my hand up and say, I think I make mistakes every day, many times a day. And it's really important for us to accept what they are and apologize for them where necessary and try to remedy them. And there's this very strange notion that we'll talk about a bit about having too much democracy, where you have too much voting. And that's a strange idea. So let's look at the British. Just in the last few days, we've been talking about the amendment to the structure of the House of Lords. And Keir Starmer, you may have all read, I'm sure you have, proposed a bill to abolish the hereditary lords. And there were about 40 of them, and at the same time as abolishing the hereditary lords, he added 30 new Labour life peers. Now, what did he have to do that? They introduced a law in September of 2024, just takes a couple of votes, and that's changed the House of Lords forever. You're probably not going to hear a strong argument from me about why we should retain the hereditary peers, even though I think this was from The Sun, quoted it as a smash-and-grab raid on the Constitution, the last of the hereditary peers. And there was an argument made we needed hereditary peers. I think that's totally bogus. But what you have to ask yourself is, was this a sensible way to change our entire constitutional structure? Because if you look at the numbers carefully, what was clearly going on here was that Keir Starmer wanted to redress the imbalance in the House of Lords, which was heavily weighted in favour of the Conservatives. So by getting rid of the hereditary lords, he got rid of 40 Tories and only 4 Labour people, so that gained him 36 on the tally, and then he appointed a whole bunch of new Labour ones. So Labour is now almost back up to where the Tories were. Now, again, if you feel that that's the right thing to do, it's certainly not a check and balance when the government in power can just do that willy-nilly. But obviously a bigger recent change in the whole structure of Britain was the Brexit referendum. And here, this is the way I see it. Not everyone sees it this way. I don't think Nigel Farage does. But really what was going on there was David Cameron wanted to just say no to the Eurosceptics in UKIP in his party. And he thought he was going to win the referendum. We were going to stay in Europe. I think that was what was really going on. So they had the 2015 EU referendum bill, which was really not well thought out. I don't think anyone thought through very carefully, what if? What if the Scots don't want to leave? What if the Northern Irish don't want to leave? One of the fascinating things about Brexit, of course, is that the Northern-Southern Ireland border runs straight through some people's homes. And the idea that suddenly half of their house was going to be in Europe and half wasn't is just a very bizarre notion. And perhaps unsurprisingly, 2 of the countries voted to remain in the EU. That would mean that wouldn't be a constitutional change in America, because you've got to have 3/4 of whatever the elements, the states are. But I don't think they'd really thought about that. But then I think they definitely hadn't thought about other things that needed to be thought through very carefully. Gibraltar, the people in Gibraltar, 96% of people in Gibraltar, which of course borders Spain, 96% of the people were allowed to vote and voted against Brexit, but they were overridden, and that was that for them. One of the really interesting things was whether people from abroad, expat British, could vote at all, and most of them couldn't. Now, I don't know whether the numbers are exactly right here. I read an article which I've cited in the material, which looks to me a teeny bit like it's been written by someone who opposed the whole of Brexit. But there were 5 million expats at the time who, according to the polls, would have voted fairly overwhelmingly against Brexit. If they'd all got to vote, apparently the result would have been different. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. It means it wasn't really thought through very much. And then, what's going to happen? And are we allowed another vote? The moment it happened, there were lots of people who were shocked by the result, and they said, we really need to have another vote. This was too close. Only 52 to 48%. And the people, including some folk who had voted against Brexit, were saying, no, this is the will of the people. Well, yeah, but will of the people for how long? And the American example is that there's not too much democracy, and indeed you can have another vote if you make a mistake, and it turns out badly. So Brexit changed Britain massively, and I don't think we had a very clear notion of how it was going to go about. So let's look about how other matters have gone for the British and the British structure. And I'm going to compare in each case, I'm going to compare the American experience with the British experience, and you make up your own mind. Let's start with the judiciary. Now, I talk too much about the judiciary, it's my world, but we'll begin with how much we've changed our judicial structure. The American judicial structure is the Supreme Court is appointed for life on advice and consent of the Senate, meaning that the president nominates a justice, and then the Senate has to advise who he should nominate and then give consent. So you have confirmation hearings. And, whatever you think of the US Supreme Court, and I'm not a massive fan of the 6-3 majority at the moment, but it has immense power. And the only real clarity that's been given over the last 250 years to the structure of the American court is Marbury versus Madison, which came very early on, where the Supreme Court made it very clear that the Supreme Court, are the final arbiter of every disagreement about how the political system works. So this is what gives the court the power to be the third real branch, that the legislature can pass all its acts and bills and stuff. The executive, the president, can do whatever the president wants, but the Supreme Court can say, no, you just can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And that has been the case in the US for its entire history. And it's what gives the court the true power of the third branch. Now, what about Britain? In the early days, when there was a struggle between the legislature in Britain and the executive, which was the king, parliamentary supremacy meant that Parliament was supreme over the king. No one back in 1700 thought that Parliament was supreme over the judges. And indeed, in the 1700 Act, it was the judges who were separated from the king and given their own independence. But now in Britain, parliamentary supremacy means that Parliament can override whatever the judges do. I think that's a massive, massive flaw in the British structure. Because really, the courts are there to protect the weak. I know they do other things too, but the real reason that you have a Bill of Rights is not to protect rich people. They can protect themselves. It's not to protect the powerful. They can protect themselves. It's to protect the people who need protection. Now, when a populist says, we don't like asylum seekers, it doesn't take long, unfortunately, for them to start proposing things like we should get out of the European Court of Human Rights, we should pull away from the European Convention of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. And indeed, even the judges on the British courts buy into this notion now of parliamentary being supreme over them. When I was running Reprieve, one of our chairs was the Lord Chief Justice of Britain, he'd retired by then. Lovely, lovely guy, Tom Bingham. And we used to go to the pub, very good thing to do, and have these raging debates about parliamentary supremacy. And he really, really believed that Parliament should be able to reverse anything he did as a judge. I think that's fundamentally wrong. But anyway, enough on the judiciary, because really today I want to talk a bit more about the other branches. Let's talk about the executive, the US executive, the president. There's only been one change in the last 240-odd years, really. And that's been the 22nd Amendment, which limited the president to 2 terms. And that was because FDR was elected 4 times. Everyone thought that was a bit too much. Up till then, there'd been no president who had gone beyond 2, and there'd been a sort of gentle person's agreement that you don't do more than 2. But then FDR was there for a long time, so they changed that. But that's the only change we've had to the US executive. Let's look at the British executive. Back in the day, at the time, 1787, George III may have been just beginning to exhibit his madness, but he was still monarch and he was still the one in charge. That's all changed over the years. And again, I doubt there's many people here who would think that's a bad idea. But Charles III over there has no power at all, really. I mean, he has the power to say a few things about how he gets taxed and that sort of thing, but very little power at all. So the executive has essentially disappeared in that form in the British system, and I don't think people have really thought this through. Where has the power of the executive gone? And I think as we go through, we'll see that the executive power has all gone to the Prime Minister's office. And there's a reason why I have a picture of Tony Blair with the presidential seal behind him, which he sometimes got accused of, because I think his was the first truly presidential prime ministership. Let's then look at the Senate. The Senate is one of the two wings, of course, of the legislature, and let's see how that's changed. In the last 250-odd years, there's been one significant amendment, which was the 17th Amendment, where originally the Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures. Now it's chosen by direct election. That's the big decision. I think it's a good idea, or it's a good change, but that's really the only amendment to the US Senate structure in all that time. Looking at Britain, very, very different. And again, you may not disagree with some of the things that have happened in Britain, but I think when you look at them, you'll see it's chaotic, and it has very little to do with democracy. This is just a chart of the party group composition. And you'll see the big red line here. That's what happened when the Labour Party came into power under Tony Blair, and they were way down here at 12% of the House of Lords, and the Tories were up at 45%. And, Mr. Blair didn't like that. So he just appointed a whole slew of House of Lords members who were Labour. Now, I'm Labour, I don't mind that. But on the other hand, it's not democratic, right? It's not democratic that you can do that. And there are other interesting things we'll see in this. Here are the Lib Dems. You wonder what they're doing there. The Tories, you can see them going up again when they were in power recently, and Labour were going down. Keir Starmer has just reversed that. Why is that going on? And what else do we see in the House of Lords? So there was a time when there were 1,300 members of the House of Lords, 1,333, I think the number was. And there were lots of people who were, they were life peers, and then there were the ones who inherited it, and there were hundreds of inherited members of the Lords. When the Labour Party got rid of most of them, they didn't get rid of all of them. Why? I don't know. Didn't make any sense to me. But the Labour Party, I love this, they cut the number of peers who were life peers to 666. Now, I think just on a very basic level, that means that no one was really debating it, because that is the devil's number. And you wonder where they came up with that. And it's totally irrelevant, but I just find that amusing. But then, since then, it's burgeoned again up to 801. So there is nothing in what is loosely termed the British Constitution that says how many members of the House of Lords there should be. And that's why every time a government comes in and they get some sort of problem from the House of Lords, they just appoint a bunch more lords to try to make sure they've got the majority there and they can keep control of it. That's quintessentially not what a second chamber is about. A second chamber is not about being gerrymandered by the government in power such that they can avoid being checked and avoid being balanced. There's just something fundamentally wrong with that. And if you ever go to the House of Lords, which I do quite often, and don't get me wrong, there are some very fine people in the House of Lords, but they shouldn't, in my view, be there. They shouldn't get there the way they got there. But nevertheless, it's incredibly cramped. There are 801 people in it. It is the second largest today legislative chamber in the entire world. And I do think there's something to be said for having a much smaller body. The Senate in the US is just 100 people. If you want to have sensible debate, I think you're much better off having fewer than 801 people. then there are other aspects of this that just make no sense to me. I don't want to pick on poor old Baroness Owen of Alderley Edge, but she was one of the 7 people Boris Johnson appointed when he had his resignation honours list. And you'll all have read about the various arguments that go on about that, whether certain people should have them, should Liz Truss have been allowed to appoint anyone. But Baroness Owen, the youngest person in the House of Lords, was actually the personal assistant to Boris Johnson. Is that a qualification for being appointed by Boris Johnson for a life tenure in the House of Lords? I don't think so. And again, I offer that as just one example of hundreds about the bizarre way in which we have people in the House of Lords, but none as bizarre as this one, that in Britain, we still have 26 Lords Spiritual. Those are Church of England bishops who were in the House of Lords. Now, where does that come from? You know, we don't have to get into all the scandals that the Church of England's been going through recently to question whether a legislature in a country that has probably now, I think if you look at it carefully, there are actually more Catholics who go to church every week. There are rapidly being more Muslims and more other groups. Bizarrely, the fastest growing group of religious people in Britain is shamanism, which I didn't know until I was researching for this. But why do we have 26 Church of England bishops? Just beyond me. Just cannot be a way to structure a government. In America, First Amendment, you can have no law that establishes one church over another. Makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know why we think we should keep these. And you know, when this was debated, and there was a review of it by Jack Straw back a few years ago, and I read his review, and Jack, who I knew quite well when he was in office, because he was Foreign Secretary and then various other things, a nice guy, he wrote that the Church of England should maintain the bishops in the House of Lords until such time as the Church of England decides they don't want them anymore. That's not a way to structure a government, it really isn't. And that probably among all the things that differentiates the House of Lords from the Senate is it has no power, really. It has a power to delay legislation, it doesn't have a power to have legislation or anything more than that. And that's really not, again, a check and balance. It's just a road bump, a speed bump in the way of the government in power. All right, so if the House of Lords doesn't balance the Commons, whereas the power that was once there, remember, the House of Lords was the most powerful of the 2 branches of the legislature back 250 years ago, where's it gone? And I submit it's gone to the Prime Minister's office, as we'll now discuss. Because when you're in number 10 Downing Street, it's you, your party, and then the cabinet. And let's just look at the influence of the party first. So if we look at the equivalent of the House of Commons in America, it's the House of Representatives. Hasn't changed in 250 years, except America's got bigger and they allow more people to vote, thankfully. But in Britain, it's very, very different to what it used to be. In Britain, you have a House of Commons that basically has all the power in theory. In practice, it has very little power. Because if you look right now at the government that's being run by Keir Starmer, he's got such a whopping majority that if you've got Jeremy Corbyn and various people of his ilk, I know Jeremy, I like Jeremy, I think he's right on a lot of issues, but he has zero influence on the Labour Party at the moment because they don't need his vote. They don't need anyone's vote because they've got such a large majority. Again, much of the power of the Commons, unless it's a very close call in the Commons, has gone to number 10. And when you're looking at number 10, it's the cabinet structure. And in America, it's the executive, the president has his cabinet. And I'll tell you, look, this is something I'm going to have to make a bit of an argument on, I know, because some of you know some of the cabinet members who are being appointed, like RFK Jr., who wants to be head of the Department of Health, and thinks that we really shouldn't have all these inoculations for things. I'm sure the doctors in the audience will agree with everything RFK Jr. says. So it's not that we have all the greatest examples of cabinet members, but the theory of America is this, that cabinet members cannot be elected, right? Marco Rubio is probably going to be the Secretary of State. He's currently a Florida senator. He has to quit being a senator to be a cabinet member. The idea is that you pick people who are experienced in the world that they're going to run. And so, when you have a Secretary of Defense, it's meant to be someone who knows about defense. When you have Department of Justice, the Attorney General is invariably a lawyer with experience. The Department of Justice is meant to be run by people who have spent their whole lives doing that. And so what happens is the president gets to choose the person that he or she wants to work with, but they have to go to the Senate and get the Senate to review it, and there'll be confirmation hearings. And this is where the Constitution comes in, because Donald Trump doesn't like the idea of having to go to the Senate and have some of the people that he wants to appoint confirmed. And he's talking about recess appointments, which is a cunning way to try to skirt around the Constitution. But he can't do it, actually, because you can't do a recess appointment unless there's a recess. And that's all about, you've heard, proroguing Parliament. You can't do that in America because the law specifically says you can't do it. The Constitution says it. So that means the Senate is going to have confirmation hearings on some people who we might think are monumentally ill-suited to the job. And that means a lot of people are just not going to get confirmed because there are 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. There are enough middle-of-the-road Republicans that actually Donald Trump will have trouble confirming some of the people he wants to put in power. How does it work? And in theory, I'm not saying it always works this way, don't get me wrong, but in theory, the people in the cabinet will not be beholden to any voters. They'll be experts in their field, and they're meant to run, what they're running. They're meant to be good at running an organization. Whether that's always true is a different question. Now, what about the British system? Really, and this is what I'm going to say, but just in a minute, don't think it's just me, because I'm going to have someone who's much more familiar say what he thinks. But in my view, the Prime Minister's patronage is really the only thing that matters. You see this all the time. The Prime Minister in Britain has a reshuffle and just reappoints different people into different jobs because he doesn't like what, or she doesn't like what's going on. But it really is down to the Prime Minister. And the question is why? In theory, most of the British cabinet members are elected officials. Why? The argument is, that's democracy. Well, no, actually, what we want in a government is a government that runs. And so you see these things, and I'm going to go through a few cabinet examples because I think they're just actually pretty shocking. But first, I want to quote this chap. Andrew Turnbull was, high up civil servant. He's now Baron Turnbull, so he's a member of another bizarre aspect of the British system. But this is what he said about the UK cabinet now. He said, ministers get appointed to new jobs not on the basis of how good they are at doing their current job. It's more about visibility. Being good at media work is crucial, as is having lots of eye-catching initiatives. It's a dysfunctional system, his words, and control of promotions is a key source of power for prime ministers. Now, when you think about that, I think it doesn't take a lot of knowledge about what goes on in the English system to see it's right. If you look at how the American economy is run, for example, we tend to have pretty decent people trying to do it. They all come from an economic capitalist perspective that I don't share, but that most people in the world do share. And basically, they're real experts. If you think back to just a couple of prime ministers ago, where Liz Truss had Kwasi Kwarteng, what did they do? They cost each person in Britain £3,000 in the space of less time than a lettuce, and we'll get to that. You have to wonder about whether he should have got appointed without a little bit of supervision. But then you look at there are lots of examples of this that if you just Google it, you'll find hundreds of them. But what I love about Greg Clark was he was accidentally appointed to be president of the Board of Trade for 4 days till they worked out he wasn't meant to be. And now that couldn't happen if you had a hearing in the Senate to determine whether he was the right person to the job. He's not the record holder. He at least was there for 4 days. But Michelle Donnellan was Minister for Education for 36 hours. And that was because she had a bit of a falling out with Boris Johnson, who didn't like her and she didn't like him. Again, not a great way to do it, but it points a finger at one of the areas that I think we're least served by, and I don't think we're well served by any of the cabinet areas in the way it's structured at the moment. But education is probably your best example, because here's Ms. Donnellan up there. I don't think she's probably the worst education minister we've had, even though she only had 36 hours. Michael Gove is the longest-serving education minister this millennium. He was in the role for about 4 years. I got to say, I disagreed with pretty much everything he tried to do. And I don't think that Michael Gove, bless him, I know him, he's a nice chap, had a few little problems in his ministerial career, that's to be sure. But what was his qualification for being Minister for Education? He was a journalist and he was a politician. And to sum it up in very grotesquely simplistic terms, I think he was trying to impose an educational system like the one I went through, where at one point I could have told you the names and dates of every Roman emperor. I'm not sure that's been very helpful in my life. I'm glad to say I've forgotten them all now. I don't have that space to waste. But that sort of rote education is quintessentially what's wrong with the legal system, with the education system, in my view. But I'm not an expert either. I'll leave you to decide that. Now, I don't know if you guys know who this is. I bet a large number don't. Do you know? That is the current education secretary, Bridget Phillipson. I'm sure she's a lovely person, but I've looked her up. I can see nothing in her resume that says she's truly qualified to be Minister for Education. And we've had 17 of these in the last 25 years. And we've had all these 5 major reorganizations of education. It's just madness. And it's because we have a cabinet system that is totally unfit for its purpose. Now, there was a reason, as I said before, that Tony Blair was accused of being presidential. It's because he was presidential, and that he had the power, along with Gordon Brown in number 11, to run the whole government. He had a big majority in Parliament. He didn't have to worry about the House of Lords after he had packed it with Labour supporters. He didn't have to worry about the king, except he had to go there once a week just to talk to the Queen at the time. And so really he could do whatever he liked. And he could push through whatever he liked. And, not everything that Tony Blair did was bad. He had been in Parliament for quite a long time. I think we can all agree that what he did later on in terms of Iraq was not a great idea. But I think at least he had time to get some decent things done. And I think it's underestimated what his government did do, in fact. I'm a little concerned about what's going on now. I've known Keir Starmer since he was a human rights lawyer. I got to say, when you're a barrister, you have very little experience of running anything because you're self-employed and you're in a set and you really don't run anything. He was DPP for a while. He's got a lot of criticism for that, a lot of which I think is probably quite unfair about the people he didn't prosecute. But he's Prime Minister, and I think he has very little experience in running a place of any sort, let alone a place like Great Britain. And yet he is the person who has such power and is able to appoint so many people and is basically unfettered at the moment. I think that's a real problem. So what you're trying to think about when you're thinking of the structure of government is how can we have a government that will run competently and effectively. You're never going to have a structure that we're going to impose that's going to have an ideology that's rigid, right? I mean, some countries do that, but I don't think Britain would do that, and America certainly doesn't. The ideology is the people who are in it, and I don't agree with a lot of the American ideology, but they have a pretty effective system for government to protect them against this sort of thing about populism. And I think even though Trump, he won't do everything bad. I mean, look, some things he might even do better than other folk. But some of the things he says where he's talking strictly about avoiding the Constitution, he said he was going to do away with it for the first 24 hours in office. He's not going to do that because he can't do that. Last time he tried to do all this stuff about the wall and about keeping people out of the country who are Muslim and so forth. He lost in the courts. He can say that all he wants, but he's going to lose, even with the 6-3 majority of his people on the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court's not perfect. I've said things like this before, and I don't want to say it in any way that sounds immodest. I've never lost a case in the Supreme Court. That's not because I'm so great. That's because I have the Constitution on my side, and therefore, if you choose the way you go about it, the Supreme Court's going to have to do what the Supreme Court's going to have to do. And that's wonderful. And it means that Donald Trump will not be able to do all the things he wants to do, even with a fairly compliant Supreme Court. So I reckon if it's Donald Trump against the US Constitution is going to come out. The thing we have to worry about, and I don't think Nigel Farage is our biggest problem. If you listen to Elon Musk, Farage is not bad enough, and we really need Tommy Robinson as our prime minister. But Farage is a populist, and there are a number of populists. It's not like Kemi Badenoch who's not a populist too, who are going to do things, who say they're going to do things that are quintessentially against the rights of individuals. Can we be sure that when it's populists against the British people or populists against asylum seekers who are coming to Britain, that the populists are not going to win out? And what's going to stop them? I don't think we got those structures in place. I think we need to think very seriously about how our whole structure has devolved in the way that it's devolved, and think whether it isn't time that we have a meeting of minds, a constitutional convention, where it's surprising the people who are in favor of it. I won't name my former MP, on which I disagreed with him on almost anything, but he wanted to have, he's a Tory, and he wanted to have a constitution for Britain. I agree with him, and I think there's a lot of people who take that position, and I think we need to think about that very seriously in the structure that we have ahead of us.